school and a longtime peace activist. He's the author of 2 prior books, Bringing the War Home, The Weather Underground, The Red Army Faction, and the Revolutionary Violence in the 60s and 70s, and also The New Life, The Jewish Students of Post-War Germany. Our Grief is Not a War Cry is the first comprehensive history of the anti-war movement of the early 2000s. It brings to life the often remarkable sacrifice of common people moved to resist invasion, occupation, war, and torture through public protest, hunger strikes, civil disobedience, and risky travel to war zones. For the book, Jeremy interviewed our very own Rusti Eisenberg of Brooklyn for Peace and made extensive use of Brooklyn for Peace archives at the Brooklyn Historical Society. Jeremy was also the lead organizer with Witness Against Torture. In 2015, he went with a group to Guantanamo, Cuba, to protest the torture prison from outside the US Naval Base. And Carolyn Rusti Eisenberg is the co-founder of Brooklyn for Peace. After 9/11, she served on the board of the United for Peace and Justice and was its legislative co-coordinator. She's a professor of US foreign policy at Hofstra University and the author of Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the War in Southeast Asia. Lastly, I do want to just thank our co-sponsors for tonight's program. We want to thank the Peace and Social Action Committee of the Brooklyn Monthly Meeting, New York City War Resistors League, World Can't Wait, Veterans for Peace, New York City chapter, and Peace Action, New York State. So let's get started, and please welcome Jeremy Varon and Rusti Eisenberg.
Let me know if this mic is working. Okay, well, it's really very, very nice to be here and to have a chance to speak with Jeremy about his book, which is actually quite remarkable. So before I even ask questions, I want to just say what a terrific book this is. And it's at many different levels, but it's something that I think all historians, as they come back and look at this period. Okay, thank you.
Is that better?
Is that better? Yes?
Really bellow.
Try it again. Okay, okay.
There you go.
We'll begin. Okay, so I'm going to start that whole sentence again. I said when historians look back in this period, I think Jeremy's book is going to be just an invaluable resource because it's very comprehensive. And it takes the anti-war movement, from really even before 9/11, and then takes it forward and goes, right up to the election of Barack Obama. And that's a lot of years of anti-war activity. And it's not just that it's chronologically important. There's a very wide lens there. Because one of the things that Jeremy really does is he captures a lot of different groups, different kinds of people, different kinds of forms of protest. And so you get a very wide overview, which is part of why I'm saying that even when historians come back to write about this, they're going to use Jeremy's book. A second thing I just want to say that Jeremy does, which a lot of times books don't when they're writing about protest, is that he ties the development of the anti-war movement to the war itself. And how that war, even from the attack on 9/11, going through Afghanistan, and then the effort to bring the country into war in Iraq, and then as that evolves, you get a very clear sense from this book about what is actually going on in the war, which I think partly is a judgment that you're making, Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you want to understand the anti-war movement, that it's not enough to just know, oh, there's a war and it's really bad. That it was really helpful to understand what was happening in the war, and you do like a really great job of it. And just one last thing before I, let you have a word at Edgewise, which is this is a very big book that Jeremy has written, and sometimes I'm very sensitive to this because I write 2 very big books too, and sometimes when you get a book, you start and it seems really interesting, and then by the time you get to page 100, you say, oh my God, I've had enough of this. So what I want to say is Jeremy's book is not like that. It actually gets stronger and stronger and more engaging as you go. So I want to encourage people not just to buy the book, but to actually read it. There's just a lot to be learned. So having said all that, let me ask you, Jeremy, the obvious question. Why did you write this book?
Right.
And how long did it take you to write this book?
Right. I mean, so first, let me thank you for that very tender introduction. Thank Brooklyn for Peace for hosting me. The group is a kind of collective protagonist in the narrative that I tell, and the more I research Brooklyn for Peace, the more deeply admiring I became of the organization. And then last, thanks to the Quaker Meeting House for hosting this event. I have deep familial roots connecting me to Quakerism, and it feels like an appropriate setting for this. In terms of why I wrote it, there's a multiple set of motives. I mean, one is the conviction that any time a grave injustice is perpetrated, it's important for the political, historical, and moral record to understand who resisted, who said no, what motivated them, what they did, and what difference their conduct made. So part of the point of this book is to honor and memorialize a large, robust, passionate movement driven by the life-changing sacrifice of countless organizers who felt that they had a personal responsibility to stop or at least limit the horror of war, and a grave injustice the war on terror was. According to the best estimates, 1 million people died as a direct consequence of America's military interventions after 9/11. 4 million people died as an indirect result. Many more wounded. 38 million people displaced, rivaling numbers after World War II, et cetera. So you had a big movement dedicated to opposing a big injustice. And then despite the movement's size and spirit, it was chronically, and you could even argue criminally underreported on, in its own day, and then struggled to break through in the media and have a sustained place in the consciousness of the public such that it could reach the political class and force changes in policy. And then partly as a reflection of that, the movement has left a very small impression in the historical consciousness of Americans since. Like, I grew up in the wake of the Vietnam War, and you couldn't think about the war without conjuring in your head images of protest, the siege of the Pentagon, the burning of a draft card, an anti-war song. The two were so intimately conjoined. And for whatever reason, the war on terror and the movement against the war on terror aren't conjoined, but I argue that they should be. And the last thing I'll say is that by studying the anti-war movement, I wanted to shine a light on the broader war on terror and then argue that we still await a comprehensive legal, political, and moral reckoning with its terrible legacy. And I feel sadly that in many ways its legacy has returned in anti-immigration policy, the sprawling detention system, the use of torture against migrants in ICE facilities, and now American soldiers marauding on the American streets and, assassinating civilians in a twisted way, like the war has come, home. So Trump has radicalized some of the worst aspects of the war on terror. People are starting to pay attention to it again, to understand the legacy that it has left. We need a new anti-war movement, and then part of that needs to be intense, thoroughgoing, and critical reflection on the damage that the war on terror did, not only to its primary victims, which is the people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, that the United States brutalized, but the damage that it did and continues to do to our own democracy.
Thank you. I want to ask you, I don't know if this is okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah. Pretend
There
you're
we
Bob
go.
Weir. Just
All
belt
right.
it out.
Trying again.
There you go.
So, Jeremy, you had a very wide lens when you were writing this book, and looked at a lot of different groups and so forth. Was there anything that surprised you in your studies about the anti-war movement? I mean, you were part of it, so I'm sure some of it was very familiar, but you went far beyond your own experience. And I'm just wondering.
I would say a couple of main things surprised me. I mean, first, as you said, I was part of the anti-war movement. So I went to all the big protests in New York City and Washington. I really immersed myself in it through my anti-torture activism starting in 2006 with Witness Against Torture. And yet myself, part of the anti-war movement, I was aware at the time probably of 5% of the activity that I described. like somehow I didn't really know that Iraq Veterans Against the War existed. I had a vague sense that September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, existed. So I had a very poor sense at the time of, the very ecosystem of, resistance, which indicated how at some level fragmented and cabined the resistance was even in its own day, and then failed to achieve a kind of gravitas as a singular movement. It was really a movement of movements and a movement of organizations pursuing private initiatives in lots of little locales, but which struggled to assert a kind of collective agency. So I was familiar with the movement, but learned an enormous amount about it, through archival research, through endless hours on YouTube, and then most happily by interviewing activists who often played leading roles in various organizations, from Rusti and Brooklyn for Peace to Medea Benjamin and Code Pink to Deb Sweet and, World Can't Wait and so forth. And then the second thing that surprised me is how poor my understanding of the Iraq War was at the time. Like, I was an avid consumer of legacy media, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, etc. And I learned in retrospect what a distorted and, in a sense, fraudulent image of the war the even sophisticated American media consumer got. And then the main thing that the mainstream media didn't report was the extent to which the insurgency in Iraq was not driven by religious fanatics and, dead enders and Saddam loyalists, but everyday Iraqis with basically nationalist motives, deeply resentful at the dysfunction, clumsiness, and ultimately the brutality of the American occupation. The resistance was a function of the severity of American violence, and quite frankly, the shameful things that our military and intelligence services did there. The torture not only in Abu Ghraib, but endemic to military operations, the hideous nighttime raids in which, grandfathers and teenagers were dragged into detention in front of their wailing mothers. In those raids, the theft of money, passports, jewelry, the deliberate vandalism of people's homes. And then, one group that I profile is called the Christian Peacemaker Teams. And at one point, one of their prominent members was kidnapped by a shadowy insurgent group led by a young man whose parents, best friend, and his fiancée were killed by U.S. missiles in the Battle of Fallujah. And he was enraged. And then the opinion of this poor Christian captive who was anti-war was that his captors were fighting to defend their honor, their family, their religion, and their country against a foreign infidel, invader. And then that wasn't, by and large, the impression of the war that you got from mainstream media. It seemed like the main struggle was Iraqis fighting against each other in sectarian conflict, and that the whole thing was this inscrutable mess of a people ungrateful, incapable, and unworthy of taking advantage of the gift of liberation that America had given them when they overthrew, Hussein. So that was the second, somewhat grim surprise. And then there were some Americans who tried to expose this truth, including this amazing journalist named Dar Jamail, who was living in Alaska, was troubled by what he saw in the news.
That was really fascinating.
Yeah, and then said, I'm going to go to Iraq to find out the truth. And then he became this incredible investigative reporter on the ground, feeding to Democracy Now! And the handful of outlets that would publish his stuff, the truth of what was going on.
It's interesting because I teach some of this at the university, and what's interesting is that in the aftermath of the war, there are these books published about what went on there. I think of Anthony Shoddid's book, for example, that of journalists who were on the ground, whether they were in Iraq or also in Afghanistan. They're really incredible books in terms of giving you an idea of what went on. And it's related to what you just said, because what's in those books and the picture that's drawn in those books is very different from what Americans were reading about in the mainstream newspapers. Just two different wars.
Right. And then, the American journalists were embedded with U.S. military forces that started during the Gulf War. They tended to see the war through the lens of American servicemen. The soldiers were their protectors, so they felt a natural affinity for them, and they had a very, distorted understanding of the conditions in which they operated. And even many of the more sophisticated journalists, like the George Packer types, would write these witheringly sort of condescending treaties about how basically fucked up Iraqi society was and how their minds were bent from years of oppression such that they weren't really capable of, self-governance. And there was a kind of liberal discourse, modestly anti-war, but basically pro-war, that frankly drove me crazy.
When I was reading your book, there were many new things that I learned, as well as being reminded of some things. And one of the things that I was reminded of was the Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. I don't know if you were aware of them at the time, but for people who haven't yet read your book, I mean, an amazing thing was the getting together of a group of people whose family members had died in the towers, and they did not want the death of their relatives to become a reason to kill more people. And they went to Afghanistan first to meet with people there, and then they several of them, kept going back to Iraq or so forth. I don't know if you knew about them before you started writing the book, and also if you interviewed them, but now you never hear, like you would never know that one of the results of the attack on 9/11 is that family members went out to these places and spoke for peace rather than for war.
Right. I mean, so these folks, to me, were like the moral heart of the anti-war movement. So they were dealing with the trauma of losing loved ones on 9/11. They realized immediately that the death of their loved ones and their suffering as immediate victims would be at the center of the call for war, officially waged to avenge their loss. And some of these folks wanted no part of that and wanted to separate them from this bellicose discourse, either because they knew their loved ones were on the side of peace and would be horrified at having their name evoked to kill more people. And then secondly, and this was their most profound point, if the horror of 9/11 was the cruel wasting of civilian lives, which it was, America doesn't answer, but repeats the crime if in its own interventions it creates orphans and widows and widowers in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. So they use their victim status to say this is the best excuse or reason for some kind of diplomatic resolution to what is understandably a security crisis. And they were, indefatigable carrying this message. The media narrative was that most 9/11 families were pro-war, many of them were, but there was this stubborn minority that, amidst their own trauma, used their circumstance to argue for peace with a credibility that in the eyes of the media and even the political class, most Americans lacked, because you couldn't accuse them of being sort of crazed ideologues. These were, victims after all. And then at the time, I didn't really know about them, even though some of my best friends now were dear friends with them. There was Rita Lazar, you might remember, she's now dead. And then a handful of these incredibly powerful personalities. And then I got to meet and in some way insinuate myself into the culture of this very special group. And then I'm now part of a group called Friends of Peaceful Tomorrows and, tries to assist them. And then interestingly, after 9/11, a whole bunch of victims' families groups formed, something like 40 or 50, for all kinds of things, medical benefits, compensation for the memorial, et cetera. And then they are, I believe, one of two organizations that came out of 9/11, of family members that still exist. And then now they're developing new leadership among their children and grandchildren, some of whom never meaningfully knew, their deceased parents. So they've left their own legacy. And then these folks, remain deeply impressive to me.
I mean, it is an incredible story, really, about these people. And I've known some of them, and being able to come out of 9/11 and to keep their eye on what's important, was difficult for the president. But you have these wonderful people that, really acted on these convictions. In your book, you have quite a bit about, in addition to that particular group, you have a fair amount of material about American peace people who were in Iraq and who stayed there for various amounts of time, both people who were in Iraq before the U.S. attacked and also people that came, once the war was underway. There were many more people and groups that seemed to have been there on the ground, and I wonder if you wanted to say a little bit more about that.
Right. I mean, so this is another, not widely known fact that there was a substantial, if, nonetheless small, presence of Western peace activists in Iraq in the run-up to the war, during the early days of the invasion, and then deep into the prosecution of the war. One group was Voices in the Wilderness, which was started by Kathy Kelly in Chicago and comes broadly out of the Catholic worker tradition. And then there were some folks coming out of the Protestant pacifist tradition, Christian peacemaker teams who had a presence there as well. And then their motives were profoundly humanitarian. I mean, first by providing anti-war witness from inside Iraq and to try to rally Iraqi civil society to protest in a way that would register internationally, reflecting Iraqis' desire to forestall an invasion, and then to try to offer aid and comfort to the many victims of the unfolding war and provide relief and solace and comfort to, bereaved and frightened families in Baghdad and outside of major cities. And then these were also some of the first folks who developed an awareness of the torture in Abu Ghraib and related facilities. They started hearing stories of people released from, detention who had been brutalized, detained without, charge, and then actually published a dossier of 70 testimonials about being tortured and submitted it to the leading generals in Iraq. And this was months before the Abu Ghraib story broke, and they tried to track people through the detention system. So they kept incredibly busy at great personal risk, oftentimes motivated by, deep religious conviction and a vision of humanity as, at its best, a kind of brotherhood and sisterhood in which we could meaningfully connect across religion, class, whatever, and they lived their convictions. And several of them did die, one in a traffic accident, and then two of them when they were ultimately assassinated by these insurgent captors. But it's a remarkable story.
No, it was remarkable to really read.
And there were
about
people like that during the Vietnam War as well, like about 150 Americans who were in and around, there's been some research and there's precedent for it.
Well, right. I mean, in some ways, I almost think that was better known, that even at the time that the Quakers, for example, had these rehab centers in very dangerous parts of South Vietnam. There was actually a reasonable amount of publicity about that. I think there was much less publicity about, folks in Iraq. I wanted to ask you a little bit about when you think about the anti-war movement in that period, how do you see the demography of that movement in terms of who's in it and who's not in it?
Right. I mean, so it shifts. So after Afghanistan, after 9/11, most Americans are on board with the invasion of Afghanistan. The numbers are through the roof. 88, 92% support the invasion. It's a handful of people speaking out who are sort of morally and ideologically predisposed to question U.S. interventionism. As I joke, it's the communists and the pacifists, people with a political critique of the history of American empire, and then folks opposed to all war who understand something of the global power dynamics. Add to that, I would say, anti-war veterans like Veterans for Peace, who were sort of chewed up as cannon fodder in the Vietnam War typically, but other interventions, and who understand the sort of inherent corruption of American war making, right? Civilians sacrificing young, typically working class men for often a perverse and self-interested set of goals dressed up as, benevolence. So in the early days, those were the three main constituencies. And then when talk of invading Iraq ratcheted up, the movement, the opposition became truly mass opposition, and the anti-war movement became truly a mass movement. Within that, there were some interesting patterns. One, women more so than men, by striking numbers, took to the streets and frankly occupied leadership positions in some of the major anti-war organizations and coalitions. And then, like women historically often do, like the hard work behind the scenes in every civil society formation you can imagine, and that was very prominent here. And then secondly, the movers and shakers of the movement really was an older generation, stretching all the way back to Vietnam, frankly, and this was a big surprise too. Like Brian Becker had a 60s pedigree, Deb Sweet had a 60s pedigree, yourself, Medea Benjamin, and some of these folks, Leslie Kagan, may have been on the younger end of the New Left, right? Teenagers during the heyday of the Vietnam War, deeply moved by the social movements of the 60s, became professional organizers in cases, or global health advocates, or sort of serial resistors to corporate predation. And then when the anti-war movement formed in the early 2000s, they had a professional skill set, connections, a lifetime of organizing experience, and in the case of somebody like Medea Benjamin, through global exchange, widespread global contacts, which helped make February 15th such an amazing day of global protest, and then a kind of fearlessness about foreign travel. Right, I mean, I'm friends with Medea, and she said, hey, we were a bunch of hippies in the 70s, and let's go to Nepal. And then there was a little bit of that devil-may-care thing where they're like, we're going to Afghanistan. I'm like, but there's bombs falling. You can't just go to Afghanistan. And they're like, yeah, we can. There's a way. And then they'd find the Pakistani border and sort of find their way in. And then there was that, kind of the best of the spirit of the 60s. Like, I'm not going to let the man, as it were, like, tell me what to do, with this sense that you need to put something on the line, to make a difference. And then youth were represented, but unlike the anti-Vietnam War movement, this was not a youth-driven movement. And like UFPJ at its big first convention, like lamented that almost nobody under 30 showed up, which isn't to say that there wasn't student protest, but it is a fact that young people were relatively docile, partly because they grew up in a post-Cold War environment, and the politics of war and peace and foreign intervention wasn't really part of their political socialization. This was the generation of the global justice movement addressing inequities. But your generation, you knew the politics of war and peace from Vietnam and Central American stuff. So there's, sociological reasons for that formation. And again, like, I caught the tail end of Vietnam, born in 1967, and always grew up with a strong consciousness about American war making, but that was only true for some people.
Right, and I think it actually continues to be an issue today, which is about, this is something in Brooklyn for Peace that we talk about, but, it's something that peace organizations are discussing all the time, which is there is a kind of a generation gap.
Right, and on that, like in the anti-torture movement, it was really hard to get anybody like under 40 to give a damn. And then, we wondered why. And then partly, like, older folks had been raised on the promise or the illusion of like American commitments to human rights and international law, and remember the sort of legacy of Nuremberg, right? So there was something to feel crestfallen about. But young people who oftentimes were more cynical didn't feel that visceral sense of outrage because at some level they were never true believers. But there's also youth mobilization around Gaza in a striking way. So it can sort of cut both ways. And then with the young, you always have to try to just figure out what is moving them, climate, Gaza, there's a handful of things.
And one of the things that I was really impressed by in your book is, as you know, the peace movement was not always peaceful. And there were very intense arguments and fights that went on within the peace movement, between coalitions, inside coalitions, and everything wasn't calm. And one of the things that's interesting in your book is that you cover those differences, and you do it in a way I think that's surprisingly even-handed. But so left me with the curiosity, number one, how did you manage that? And number two, did you find that you really did have judgments as you went along about, well, that was a good thing to do, and no, that was really a waste of time? Did you
Right.
have those private judgments?
Right. I mean, the most obvious schism was between the Answer Coalition, which is a hard left formation coming out of the Workers' World Party, and United for Peace and Justice, that actually had a lot of CP members in it, but was the more mainstream coalition that in its right wing intersected with the left wing of the Democratic Party. And then there were huge tactical ideological struggles between these formations. My even-handedness is a function of partly being blessed to have known and been friends with Brian Becker, the head of the Answer Coalition, going back to the first Gulf War. So we were sort of on good terms. And then I interviewed him to try to give a fair-minded perspective on the hard left formation that he sort of ostensibly led. And his guard was less down with me than it would have been otherwise, because they're so used to people, even on the left, hating them, frankly. But then my friends in the kind of Catholic workery, pacifist Berrigan world were much more towards the side of UFPJ. And then I would say that's where my heart kind of lay, though I didn't want to make too much of that in the book to violate a kind of nominal, neutrality. And then, Answer was fantastic at the initial organizing, and then did the first national demonstration against the war in Afghanistan before it even started on September 28th of 2001. And then we're first out of the gate opposing the buildup in Iraq, but you could make a case that the totality of their worldview by most American standards is so extreme, pro-Syria, that their message could not ultimately resonate on the scale it needed to if this war could be turned around. And UFPJ, I thought, was much sharper and saner in terms of understanding mass mobilization and the necessity of appealing outside a narrow ideological bubble if you wanted the actual result of stopping or slowing the war. And then in the middle of that, I would put the Not in Our Name coalition, which has roots in the Revolutionary Communist Party, and yet has this talent, like approaching a genius, like not to have that hard ideological commitment get in the way of coalition building, right? And then the Not in Our Name coalition was very wide-ranging and was an important early formation to catalyze the views of Americans deeply troubled with the direction that the war on terror was, headed in. So there's all kinds of possibilities, but a combination of just the decency and the pragmatism of the UFPJ types, whatever that means, kind of held sway with me.
I wonder, I actually have 12 questions,
Yeah,
so
sure,
I'm
sure.
trying to race
Yeah,
through.
please, and then
I'm only at 4.
yeah, you can jump ahead.
I jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I'm struck by is that a fair amount of the writing that's going on right now about the Iraq War doesn't have the peace movement in it, right, as even something to even discuss. And, I think for some of that writing, the story is what happened when the troops went there, and in Iraq, it turned out to go very poorly, and then eventually most of the troops left. But all those things happened because of the war itself and what was happening on the ground. And I'm sort of wondering, in general, what you think about how effective the peace movement was, or even if you wanted to say specific things that you thought were effective. And also, do you have a sense of how the peace movement might have moved policy, or are we going to say that it didn't?
Okay, I mean, this is a very, very big question that's moving us away from this sort of terrain of description about which I could sort of talk endlessly. But it's an important field of questions. I mean, so the first thing to say is that the anti-war movement makes almost no appearance in any of the literature about the war on terror, including by sympathetic writers like Spencer Ackerman. It's like as though it didn't exist. And then, without being like too biased here, I think there's like an anti-left animus or hostility, rooted in the Red Scare and McCarthyism that runs so deep that there's almost a national allergy to acknowledging left politics as having any legitimate place within our political life, even though it patently does. And then, I'm sorry, but the anti-war movement was overwhelmingly a movement of the political left. From revolutionary communist to progressive to liberal in a righteous sense, with a little bit of right-wing libertarian participation. But the numbers of folks who participate in protests, something like 2 to 3% of protesters were self-identified Republicans, right? I mean, it's minuscule. So that, and then the allergy is so strong, it even like infects people who should, know better. And then when we tell the story of the civil rights movement, whose agency everybody acknowledges, that like the leftism coursing through the civil rights movement is often suppressed as though we're still in the Red Scare. Now, in terms of, efficacy, it's a very complicated question, and then I go a little bit back and forth. When I was writing the book, my main sense is that this is ultimately an extended tragedy showing the terrible price that democracies or any society pays when principled conscientious dissent is dismissed and ridiculed, and the warnings of informed voices of caution are overridden by belligerent leaders, right? So hundreds of thousands of people died and millions of people suffered as a result of leaders not heeding the caution of conscientious voices. And there should have, at the very least, been a more earnest debate to determine what America should or shouldn't do. And then most of the debate was frankly a charade. I mean, Bush was going to do what he was going to do anyhow, WMD a total propagandistic lie. So for me, the war is a symptom of like a profound breakdown in commitment to democracy. And not only have we not recovered, I think the democracy deficit has gotten, qualitatively, even worse. And yet over time, the anti-war movement, made a difference. So it had a consistent narrative about the deceitful origins, disastrous course, and unacceptable cost of the war in Iraq. And then more and more events on the ground fit with that narrative. And more Americans started to see the war, in a sense, in the language and through the lens of that criticism. And eventually, as I describe it, the American people caught up with the anti-war movement, and then enough people in the political class caught up with the American people to make the Iraq war, beyond a certain point, politically unsustainable. And then it is pretty remarkable when Mission Accomplished is declared 74% of the public is for the war. By 2004, it's down to about 50%, though Bush wins re-election. By the summer of 2005, which is the real turning, you have a durable majority of people being against the war. Democrats win the elections by a landslide, running on an anti-war platform. The Iraq Study Group says it has to end. Obama's elected, troops are gone by 2011. And then now something like 62% of the public judges the war a mistake, including 58% of veterans of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, like the very people who fought it. And there appears to be something like a national consensus that stupid wars like Iraq are bad wars. And right now, that's the only thing constraining Trump, arguably. And there is something like an Iraq syndrome, fragile, coming apart before our eyes, perhaps, but its very existence is in part an achievement of the very anti-war movement that in another evaluative capacity, I judge as a failure because it didn't stop the carnage it so desperately wanted to stop.
It's interesting about the invisibility of so much of the protest. There's so many different pieces of that. At one point, I had a student in my class who was an adult, who was going back to college. And he was telling our class he was on a boat where they shot the missiles into Baghdad. And he said that the people on the boat, the Americans, a lot of them objected to it, which is something you never hear, right? Like zero. There are things flying in the air and it's very exciting and everybody's supposed to be happy. He said no. There was a tremendous amount of dissent and a bunch of people got dishonorable discharges and paid a significant penalty for the fact that they were objecting to that very initial attack on Baghdad. And I always think about that. I mean, that person actually was suffering from PTS. It was like no joke. But it was, to me, it was like kind of emblematic of the fact of how so much of the dissent got buried. Like there are many, many different places where it was felt.
Including very powerfully in the military itself. And then a lot of soldiers were really skeptical of the Iraq war and objected to it for the reasons anybody might. Where are the WMD? Do we really need to, go to war? Are we really liberating the Iraqi people? And yet, as volunteers in the military, their private judgment on their mission couldn't be expressed, and yet a significant number, did resist after their deployment, speaking out against the war, forming this amazing organization called Iraq Veterans Against the War, refusing deployment. Some were court-martialed, some spent time in jail. They tended to be ostracized by the military community, sometimes functionally disowned by their veteran parents, went to Canada, suffered poverty, untreated PTSD. And these are some of the hero victims of the war itself, who in cases admitted being perpetrators of horrible violence. And Camilo Meja, who you might know, was a specialist in Iraq and then participated in the physical abuse of Iraqis and felt deeply ashamed about what he did, refused redeployment, spent a year in jail. And from jail said a very American thing, like, I'm freer than I've ever been because I'm answerable to my conscience and I know I've done the right thing. And I pity the people living in conflict with their truest moral self, including maybe even, George Bush. And that's Thoreau, that's Martin Luther King, that's Gandhi, that's this unbelievable American tradition that puts fidelity to conscience, look at where we are, right, as one's deepest human commitment, not to nation, and certainly not to people who lead nations into war.
I want to just ask one thing about the overall frame of your book,
Sure.
and then I have a feeling people probably have questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also want to give you time to talk about how what you've learned bears on the miserable present that we're in. But just to go back, here's what I was understanding from your book.
Please.
Which is that, again, you have the war in your book, which is really important. In other words, it's not just the history of the anti-war movement, it's also what's happening in the war. And it seems to me that part of what you're showing is that the anti-war movement becomes more effective depending on what's going on. And that to some extent, how the events in Iraq materialized, including that there were no weapons of mass destruction, the insurgency, that these events that take place on the ground, that it's in that context that the anti-war movement is actually able to have an impact on policy.
Right. And then, here's the unfortunate axiom that a public tends to love a war that it's winning, defined by military victory and small costs in blood and treasure, and then gets very anxious about a war that it's, not winning or sort of outright losing. So the worse the war goes, the better it is for an anti-war movement. No, nobody wants, misery and suffering for American soldiers and Iraqis, but, public skepticism grew when Iraq became an ungovernable maelstrom of chaos and death, in which no policy objective seemed achievable. And then the anti-war movement wasn't like glib in the face of that, obviously. It was horrified and all the more urgently tried to highlight the human cost. And then I think the great sort of catalytic moment was the stand that Cindy Sheehan took outside, Bush's summer ranch with a simple question: for what noble cause did my son die? And then in asking that question, she's really asking, why is the war being fought at all? And then people were incredibly moved by the poignant defiance of a bereaved mother demanding an answer from the man responsible for her loss. And a lot of people, parents especially, could see in her story their own sense of caretaking. And then we're given a sign here. So
Are we giving time? So I'm just going to ask the last question, and then people can interrupt now.
Yeah, very good.
You're
Perfect.
allowed
Okay,
to interrupt.
Yeah.
But obviously, what's on everybody's mind, I think, is what we're in right now, right? In
Right.
terms of Venezuela, I think many of us are concerned now that there'll be more things happening in Venezuela and even possible attacks on other countries. That's now opened up. And I'm wondering how the things that you've studied and thought about, how that might be shaping how you see the present.
Right. I mean, so I'm trying to, piece together all of this as we speak, and then just like penned an op-ed that hopefully some paper will run. And then, my basic assessment is that what Trump is doing, is so awful, both in the actual policy, abducting a foreign leader, claiming a right to its oil, and in the ultimate license he claims to engage in such action without any of the traditional constraints, however weak, to American war making. He's not answerable proudly to international law, the opinions of allies, the UN Security Council, congressional approval, or even the will of the people who aren't in favor of the policy. And he said, I don't need international law, as though he's the state, and the only thing constraining me is my own morality, which is no morality at all. So with Trump, there's always the policy and then the authoritarian impetus to it. The authoritarianism is both means and an end. And not only is this sort of familiar American predation recalling gunboat diplomacy, it's a kind of shocking undoing of that very thin skein of accountability that we assume of our leaders. So the question is, and I will wrap up my answer, how do you constrain a president who feels he operates with no constraints? And the one constraint he does feel, this is repeating what I said earlier, is his hesitancy to plunge us into stupid war. Like, that's the best we got. All this could be another Iraq. And then it's the best we got because A, it's true, it could spiral out of control quickly, and because it provides some bridge to those handful of elements in the MAGA universe who are serious about non-intervention, even if for a different set of reasons than those on the left. And I think we quickly need an anti-war movement, or at the very least have anti-war politics reflected in larger resistance to Trump. So I was very happy at the No Kings thing on Saturday that it was no kings, no ICE, no war, right? So it's being represented in our messaging, yes. But we need to sort of take seriously contingent alliances with people in Trump's base. And then it might constrain him to engage in what I call imperialism light, like we get the oil without spilling American blood. And then that's, hardly something to root for, but the hope is that the danger of imperialism light to spiral into the imperialism hard and another Iraq that nobody wants could have him, de-escalate. And then entirely unclear if that will happen. But we are in a new dangerous era of American impunity. And then Bush, for all of his cowboy arrogance, did get congressional approval, sought a UN resolution, and considered himself, if only for show, accountable to some version of, authorization residing in other than his own decision as decider. We have a Schmittian scholar, so that policy is other than the dictates of a dictator. Thank you. Very good. So we've got like half an hour, and then if folks want to ask questions or make comments, please do.
Okay, we'll open the floor now for some Q&A. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question?
How would you slot in Black Lives Matter movement in the George Floyd protest?
I mean, for me, the historic frame of reference of Black Lives Matter would be the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, primarily. And I'm sure some Black Lives Matter activists got a meaningful start in their activist career organizing against the war. So there's like a kind of connection there. And then I think Black Lives Matter wanted a kind of third big moment of civil rights following the Civil War and Reconstruction, the civil rights movement, like a deeper reckoning of endemic chronic racism in the criminal justice system especially, and in, an economy with sort of design differential outcomes for sort of different kinds of people. And it was, a robust and like magical movement. And yet, sadly, you could argue that like the backlash against it has proven so much more powerful than the movement itself. And then partly what it shows is that the forces of white supremacy, which drove the founding of this nation, are much more deeply embedded in the fabric of this society than many of us, would have liked to believe. And then the actual record of tangible reform on the side of racial justice was frankly fairly small. And then the dismantling of, DEI as this kind of liberal institutional version of a kind of weak commitment to racial justice has been so unbelievably severe. And then it's painful as an American educator being told, like, even to discuss race or discuss gender or admit to the reality that transsexual people exist is an act of treason against, common sense, and then have an administration willing to punish people for, dialogue in service of truth. And then my sense and what I tell my students is that we will hear again from Black America, for sure. Like the problems of racism haven't been solved, and there will be like a fourth moment And I don't know what will trigger it. But that population that's been sidelined and told it doesn't matter as the primary racism shifts to Latinos, or the primary public racism, like the concerns of that community haven't gone away, and there's resilience and traditions of resistance running through African American history that I'm sure will be activated at some point in the future. Thank you for the question.
Going to your dismay at realizing as you doing your research how much mainstream media was misleading you, what did you learn and who do you trust that you read now?
I mean, I don't read anymore. Who does, right? Democracy Now! Is pretty effing remarkable. Like, I wasn't an avid viewer of it. Like, I have a friend who says, like, people love Democracy Now! Everywhere except in New York City for some reason. But a lot of my research of the anti-war movement like tracked so well with what Democracy Now! Was reporting. They did cover the movement thoroughly. They did have journalists in Iraq who, sort of reported the truth. They're professional, it's smart, it's, sort of editorial in a thoughtful kind of way. And, I watch MSNBC not because I love it, but because I want to know what the establishment liberal progressive mind is sort of thinking and how it's seeing the world. And then frankly, Keith Olbermann, who made the network with this show called Countdown, was famous for these unbelievable Jeremiads against Bush, which were like hilarious and hard. I mean, he pulled no punch. And then sometimes, I love me a good like blowhard, like based in fact, who can let the anger rip in a thoughtful way, because too often we're like discouraged from like letting the world know what we really think for fear of the names our enemy is going to call us. And in a point in which Trump sees a violent state response to even mild forms of dissent, we can't back down and censor ourselves. And then, Al Jazeera was good on the war on terror, but has like some of its own problems. And then I should say, like, the last thing, funnily, like for years and years, we would protest against the Guantanamo. And then the American media almost never paid any attention to us, like at all. Occasionally BBC, like once every 3 years. Al Jazeera, good. Iran, great. Venezuela, great. And Russia TV, great. Like they would do incredibly good stories as a matter of state propaganda to like sort of show how horrible America is. And like it doesn't have to be this way, clearly. And then the one group who we refused to talk to was Iranian state TV, because torture is officially a state policy. And I once told that to one of their editors. And then like he hung up on me when I said that you all sponsor torture. And then there, so there's like a level of like shilling and dishonesty, like broadly on the left, if you even want to call it that you have to be on, the lookout for.
I would argue that one of the reasons that the mainstream media hasn't given much coverage is because what they do is they look for prominent political leaders. So typically they'll get a Democrat and a Republican who don't reflect the views of certainly anti-war people, especially in the war on terror. Hillary Clinton and John Kerry were both privately against the war, but for political expediency, they voted for it. And they discovered, had they stood on principle, one of them might have been president. And they weren't. Now what we get is we get some more opposition, but note every Democrat who opposes what happened in Venezuela, before they say anything else, they say, oh, Maduro was terrible and I'm glad we got rid of him. But we shouldn't have done it that way. I'm waiting for a Democrat to say we shouldn't have kidnapped Maduro, we should release him.
Right, I mean, I hear you. And I don't know if I would give Hillary that much credit. I don't know if privately she was anti-war. And then some people in this room might agree with me. I know you dislike Hillary intensely.
I think that her husband told her there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Okay. Right. I mean, she's sort of mired in hypocrisy. And then, partly to continue to answer a prior question, it is important to have big vocal spokespeople, like somebody in the Democratic Party to really own Venezuela in a way that Kucinich owned the Iraq War. I mean, he had a principled stand against this through and through, year after year. Like, not all of them, were ambivalent or, compromised. But there's a demand for a reflexive kind of, patriotism. And I think the community that suffered this the worst, far and away, was like Muslim Americans and Arab Americans, who had to preface any public sentence with, of course, Al-Qaeda is horrible and I decry the 9/11 attacks and Wahhabism is off, as a condition for having any legitimacy to participate in public discourse. And Muslim participation in the anti-war movement was understandably small because of the intense Islamophobia. And I have a handful of incredibly brave Islamic friends who call it like they see it, sort of damn the consequences. And they're taking, extraordinary degrees of risk. And then people with tremendous power and privilege with no such risk should feel more free to, speak the truth. But at the same time, it is complicated that Maduro wasn't good for Venezuela, and the current Iranian regime is, a corrupt, dictatorial, theocracy. And then another piece of this is that, like, empire always claims virtue. Always. And then Trump stresses much more the prosperity line than the freedom line. And then he could get liberals wrapped around his finger if he talked about liberating the people of Iran or the people of Venezuela. Like, you're already seeing some voices in the mainstream saying, oh, lean into the humanistic story. And a lot of the liberal hawks sort of fell for that. But the language of American empire and the language of American freedom were always one and the same. And then you can't be distracted by the language of freedom from understanding the element of self-interest that is coursing through these grand claims at emancipation. And people in Afghanistan were sort of twice victimized. I mean, by the bombing that killed soldiers, but women got a taste of freedom and could go to school and be doctors. And I know people who did reconstruction work in Afghanistan, and like all of that is real. And then the United States cuts and runs, and now it's back to burqas and you can't play soccer. So, we kindle the hopes for emancipation of these people. And then when the cost is too high, like, we walk away. And then that's part of the dirty business of empire as well. And that's the kind of thing that the Kathy Kellys worked against. They never stopped doing the work of trying to comfort and empower people in great need overseas who needed genuine understanding. Let's take one more or two more, Deb and Andrew, and then we'll call it a day. And thank you so much for coming, Simon. Yeah, peace.
Hey, I still haven't read the book. Sorry.
That's okay. No.
I'm here to get my copy tonight. But I just wanted to eject conceptually something into those moments, starting with the anti-Vietnam War movement and very importantly around the war on terror. And that was consciously bringing in internationalism to the movement and fighting for the idea that our allegiance is to the humanity, to the people of the world. That was and is a very powerful thing that there's every basis to fight for as the world is shrinking and as people are now being able to see minute by minute people being killed in everywhere from Gaza to now maybe Tehran, I don't know. But being conscious about this international thing was very important in overcoming the narrow national American chauvinism that has just been woven into this country.
Yeah, and then Not in Our Name was very intent on projecting this positive globalism. Its slogan was a picture of the world. And, I'm almost looking beyond American rhetoric for any solace or any ground and moving more and more to this hope that there's a kind of global spirit that might be more powerful than the chauvinism you described. Okay, Andrew, take us out. And thank you, Deb.
You outlined the parallels between Iraq and Venezuela very well, and there's, many obvious ones. Greenland is a bit of a different puzzle, right? We already have military bases there. We can have any of the minerals we want. They're willing to make contracts for us to sort of extract that, as far as in the last stuff I've been reading. The Danish and NATO forces are patrolling they're keeping the Russians and Chinese at bay. All the arguments don't make sense. They're a nominal ally, though may not be for long. So in what you've learned about the Iraq War, or you've been thinking about the parallels to contemporary moment, and the successes and failures of the peace movement, what would be your advice around Greenland, or is there anything that, any thoughts you have on that one? It's a very odd one.
I mean, Trump loves the reality and spectacle of domination. He's a predator as a businessman, as a sexual being, as a leader. And the fact that we already have most of what we need from Greenland, that isn't enough. And then it's incredibly low-hanging fruit. And hands off Greenland is hard when the population is, 150,000? He's promised 100. Right, okay. It is sort of a minuscule population that has a huge land mass. And then, NATO is in a pickle because taking Greenland, in principle, would obligate the countries of NATO to fight the United States, but it's impossible. And then Trump said, actually, NATO will be stronger with Greenland. And in a twisted sense, in terms of resources and military and access to rare minerals, it might be, and the Europeans will probably go along. And then what Trump has discovered is, that he who has the bigger guns has the power, and he has the audacity to lean into this principle that no American leader has since, World War II. And then when people say international norms and, sovereignty and agreements about this and that are imperiled, yes, they're imperiled, because here you have a guy who's I will take what I want, stop me if you can. And, nobody's going to lay down their life in this country for Greenland, especially if no Americans die in the seizure of, its capital, whatever the hell it's called. So being realistic here, I'm not optimistic about Greenland. It's absurd. And then I think, Tom Tillis or some Republicans are this is absurd. And then maybe enough people in Congress will say, you can't do this. But I don't know how they can enforce that. But anyhow, did not expect the Greenland question to close, but thank you. Okay, very good. This was wonderful. And then let me say, oh, you have your hand up? Or, okay. No, I'm done. Just go for it, quick. Okay, very good, thank you. There's always that tech guy, right? Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think it's a very quick question, but it's
Okay.
something as I'm new to Brooklyn for Peace, and it's a question that I've been reconciling for a while now. My background is organizing in faith-based spaces, and so Brooklyn for Peace feels very aligned with that in so many ways. I recently graduated with my master's in social work, and so many of my friends who are younger, 20s, early 30s, is kind of seeing or questioning if nonviolence works. And I'm curious, as someone who's studied, so you made the comment earlier of these two kind of factions of the anti-war movement, some being peaceful and some being less peaceful. And you were saying that your heart kind of lies in the more, it sounded like maybe non-violent approach. I don't know, I think I'm just curious if you have thoughts around that. And I don't even know if my question is which do you think is more effective, because what does effective even mean? Defining what effective means is in and of itself a complicated question, but yeah, I don't know. Any just thoughts around that?
Sure, thank you. And then just to clarify, the more militant anti-war coalition was by no means violent. And then they actually practiced a kind of boring politics of one endless mass rally after another. And people would sort of ridicule how unmilitant they were tactically. And in the anti-war movement, there was almost no violence at all, comparatively little civil disobedience, very small efforts at direct disruption of the war machine. Like there were some people on the West Coast who tried to prevent ships from literally bringing war material to Iraq. There was a dock workers strike in San Francisco. And then some instances of mass civil disobedience, but more in the register of symbolic resistance than actual, sabotage. And then the violent, I understand the frustrations of a lot of young people, but there's a basic balance of forces question here. And then, Trump is itching to kill people. And then like that's not give them more excuse than, we need. It affirms their narrative that the left is a bunch of, violent maniacs, and then you're probably going to get arrested or killed. And, I've talked to, I'm good friends with a lot of the former weathermen, and they're like, today, very hard to pull off. To go underground with, cell phones and bank cards, like if you watch enough Dateline, you can't really disappear in this society. And then the other big thing that I say is that in the 60s, all of the violence in first world countries like Germany, the United States, Italy, it was riding the wave of a global, violent, anti-colonial insurgency in the name of socialist-leaning national liberation movements. So it was part of a larger context of the demobilization of centuries of colonialism. And then that's what gave it its grammar and its grand sense of purpose. But to say today, I'm going to violently attack America, it doesn't have that historic support, and there's unbelievable risk. And then if people read, there's this thing called the sort of Turtle Island Coalition, and then a bunch of people just got busted for allegedly plotting violent attacks somewhere, I believe, in California. And then if, what they're saying is true, and I read the indictment, these folks will spend decades in prison, and some of them are in their 20s, and I never want to see a young person throw their life away that way, even though one emotionally understands the idea to strike back at a violent aggressor in a language that they understand. So thank you.